Hello and welcome to the first video lecture on Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is going to be a bit longer than 17. Like I said, typically those two chapters are one, so we're kind of continuing on with the endocrine system. In this chapter we focus more on the actual glands or organs, the specific hormones, and then what do those hormones do to their target cell or target organ. So looking at our chapter topic, it's really going from one gland to another and learning their hormones. We start kind of at the hypothalamus and pituitary. This is a very important relationship between these two organs, and they're often thought of kind of the top tier endocrine glands. They do a lot of control of other endocrine organs. So we start with kind of hypothalamus-pituitary relationship. Then we move on to the pituitary and look at the two lobes. So the pituitary gland has an anterior lobe, so the anterior pituitary, and it produces a number of different hormones. So some glands produce one or two. The anterior pituitary, I believe we're going to look at about 7 hormones that it produces. Then we're going to get into the posterior pituitary. And there's a couple hormones there. They're actually produced by the hypothalamus, but the posterior pituitary secretes them into the bloodstream. So we'll learn a couple hormones there. Then we move to the pineal gland, which is also considered part of your brain, and it produces one hormone, melatonin. The thyroid gland in your neck and the parathyroid glands are in your neck. So we'll learn about the difference between those two glands and then the hormones they produce. Then we'll move down into the abdomen where we'll find the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys. And there's 4 hormones we're going to learn there. The pancreas is also in your abdomen. We'll learn a couple hormones that it produces to regulate blood sugar. And then we kind of finish up with the gonads, the ovaries and testes. And obviously we're going to get to the reproductive system at the end of the semester, so we're not really going to get deep into specifically what all these hormones do for the reproductive system, but we're just going to kind of introduce them now. And then finally, there are other organs and structures and tissues that might produce hormones. Like I mentioned in a previous video, almost every organ in our body produces some type of hormone. So we're going to just touch on a few of these other organs. Okay, so we start with the same picture we left off on in the previous chapter, and this is just identification of the endocrine glands. So hopefully you're starting to learn where those are and can identify them. What you also want to do is when you're studying anatomy, don't just study anatomy. Study some of the physiology that corresponds to that gland or organ or structure. So when you're studying this picture and you're identifying, let's say, the pineal gland sticking off the back of the brain, you should ask yourself, okay, what hormone or hormones does that gland produce, and what does that hormone do? All right. And when you're learning hormones, this is kind of the step-by-step method you should take. So we learn the gland, so let's say it's the pineal gland. We learn what hormone or hormones it produces. So in this case, it's just one, melatonin. Often there are specific targets that hormone respond or stimulates or causes in a response. Sometimes there's many targets. Sometimes we might not even really get into the specific target. It kind of depends on the hormone. But for example, the pineal gland, we're not going to really look at targets. We're going to look at this response, which is kind of setting your night and day cycle. In particular, melatonin will go up in the evening and help you sleep. Other hormones, we got to learn this precise target and exactly what that target does. And then typically some hormones might be high or low. So if a gland overproduces the hormone, we call that hypersecretion. If it doesn't produce enough of the hormone, we call that hyposecretion. So some hormones we're going to learn some disorders, some hormones we're not. So it kind of, like I said, it kind of depends on the hormone. Okay, so let's begin with the hypothalamus and pituitary. We know where they're located, so we look in the brain. The hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon, so it's this area here. Sticking down from the hypothalamus are the two lobes of the pituitary, and they're attached. There's a little attachment there called the infundibulum. And infundibulum actually means funnel, because this structure kind of acts like a funnel in that hormones can get from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary. There's also some neurons that are going to be used to synthesize and deliver hormones down to the posterior pituitary. So this connection is called the infundibulum. It's kind of a physical connection between the two. But there's also a functional connection, or a relationship the hypothalamus has with the pituitary. And the relationship is different between the hypothalamus and the anterior lobe compared to the hypothalamus and the posterior lobe. And we'll get into that once we move on to the pituitary. But there's a little bit different relationship here. For example, the anterior pituitary, which is shown right here, is actually glandular tissue. So it produces hormones. You can see it. These are the hormones it synthesizes. Growth hormone, one called ACTH for short, TSH for short, FSH and LH for short, and we'll get into their actual names as we go, and then a couple other here. So these are all hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. But the hypothalamus controls this production. All right, so the hypothalamus is going to kind of tell this anterior lobe when and how much growth hormone to produce, or how much TSH to produce. So the relationship between the hypothalamus and anterior is more of a controlling relationship. The hypothalamus kind of determines when and how much of a hormone the anterior should produce. When we look at the hypothalamus and posterior, I call that more of a giving relationship, because the hormones are actually produced by the hypothalamus in these little neurons. And then the hormones actually get transported to the posterior, so kind of given to the posterior pituitary. And then the posterior pituitary puts them into the bloodstream. So the posterior pituitary is technically not a gland, in that it's not made up of what we would call glandular tissue, and it doesn't produce the hormones. It actually gets them from the hypothalamus. So a little bit different relationship between hypothalamus and the two lobes of the pituitary gland. So let's start. This is, again, kind of a schematic here, showing you kind of where we're going to be moving when we get into the pituitary gland. So if you think of the hypothalamus, right, as being on top, right, it's both physically above the pituitary, but it also is going to play a huge role in what the pituitary does. In order to control the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus produces hormones that are either called releasing hormones, so that's going to be kind of a stimulating hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to release a hormone into the bloodstream, or it might produce an inhibiting hormone. So in that case, the hypothalamus is basically telling the anterior pituitary not to release that hormone into the bloodstream. So again, that's kind of what I would call a controlling relationship. Over here, it's giving. So there's two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, that are actually produced by the hypothalamus, but they're going to be transported to the posterior pituitary. So these are then those hormones. So again, I just rewrote oxytocin and ADH here because they're really just going from the hypothalamus to the posterior and then into the bloodstream. Whereas the anterior pituitary is actually producing these 7 hormones. And we're going to get to each of them individually. These are just the abbreviations for now. But These are produced by the anterior pituitary when told to produce them. All right? And then all these hormones are going to go into the bloodstream. All right? That's what most of the hormones do. And then they're going to find their target organ. And then that organ does something. Okay? So hopefully this kind of better explains this relationship here. And now it's just a matter of going and learning, okay, what does oxytocin do? What does antidiuretic hormone do? What do these hormones of the anterior pituitary do? We start with the anterior pituitary, and what I tried to do in this PowerPoint is I tried to get every hormone on one slide. I'm not a big fan of having to learn one hormone using a whole bunch of slides. So again, you'll find that my PowerPoints aren't that lengthy. I'm not a big fan of having 80 slides in a PowerPoint. But what that means is pretty much every slide in my PowerPoint has information that you're going to need to know. Okay? All right, so we're starting with the anterior pituitary. So that's the gland. We're going to go through each of those 7 hormones. We're going to look at the primary targets. So that's going to be the organ that has the receptors and therefore will respond to that hormone. And like I mentioned, some hormones have a wide range of targets. Some hormones are very specific and might only have 1 or 2 targets. But the major targets of human growth hormone are the liver, skeletal muscle, and bone. All right, those are the big ones. And that should make sense as far as muscle and bone because you have to stimulate muscle and bone to grow. Right? This is a growth hormone. So this hormone is very important when these muscles are, growing and these bones are growing early in life. Now, growth hormone is not only important early in life, it's important throughout your entire life, and we're going to see why in a little bit. Liver is the one that's a little tricky, but the liver kind of just acts as an intermediate. What growth hormone does is it stimulates the liver to produce other growth factors. And they're called insulin-like growth factors. They don't really have much to do with insulin. They kind of look like insulin. But the key here is they are also growth factors. So then those are going to go and stimulate other organs for growth. So think of the liver as kind of an intermediate here between growth hormone and the main targets, muscle and bone. So all this stuff kind of has to do with growth, if you think about it. So growth, obviously, of body cells, both early in life and throughout life. Protein synthesis, because you need a lot of protein in order to grow tissue. It has an added benefit in that it can really help in repairing tissue. So when you get injuries and you have to reform tissue, human growth hormone is very important for that. And these last couple things has to do with energy. In order to grow tissue, you need to get a lot of energy to do so. So lipolysis means breaking down fat. And when you break down fat, you can harness the energy. And then obviously glucose is going to be a source of energy. So human growth hormone can increase blood sugar levels. Okay, you might have heard of HGH in the context of anti-aging. So a lot of individuals will take human growth hormone. They kind of believe that it allows people to live a little bit healthier and longer life. Sometimes it's given again in order to repair tissue. Most sports kind of banned the use of HGH, but in some cases it's being a little more widely used by the general public. All right, so any disorders related. There's 2 forms of hypersecretion. So that's when the pituitary produces too much of this human growth hormone. One form is called gigantism, and that kind of makes sense, right? People might grow much larger than normal. And then one is called acromegaly. Gigantism, the difference between the two, and we'll get into this on the next slide, is when. When do we see this elevated human growth hormone? Gigantism is early in life, so before you know you've reached adulthood, so the bones can still grow in length. Acromegaly is later in life, when the bones have already kind of stopped growing in length and they can only still grow maybe a little thicker. And then the hyposecretion is known as pituitary dwarfism. So let's take a look at some images. So here's gigantism. So this man had high levels of human growth hormone early in life. So it stimulated the growth of those, bones quite significantly above normal growth. Acromegaly, again, the bones have stopped growing in length because those growth plates have fused. But they'll get thickening, so thickening of the mandible here, thickening of the lips. You get kind of an enlargement of the nose here. You get kind of an enlargement of this area above the eyes, kind of the furrow here of the eyebrows. And then the hands tend to get enlarged. So not necessarily a dramatic height difference, but more thickening of bones. And then here are individuals with pituitary dwarfism. Okay, next one. So kind of moving on. Next one is called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So in this case, the hormone is telling you what it does. It stimulates the thyroid gland. So it's produced by the anterior pituitary when the hypothalamus tells it to. So again, we're still being controlled by the hypothalamus ultimately. When this hormone is produced, it goes into the blood and it stimulates the thyroid gland. And we'll talk more about the thyroid gland when we get to it, but it produces a couple major hormones we collectively call thyroid hormones, or T3 and T4. And we'll talk more about what these do, but the most important word to remember for thyroid hormones is metabolism. So these hormones are going to stimulate metabolism. All right. There are some disorders of hypersecretion and hyposecretion. We're going to talk about those more when it comes to the thyroid, because you could have hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. But what's interesting is if an individual has hypothyroidism, they're actually going to have an overproduction of TSH as kind of a compensatory mechanism, right? So if someone has hypothyroidism, they have low thyroid hormones. Well, how would the body respond in a way to maybe bring those thyroid hormones up? Is that they will produce more of the TSH hormone. So a lot of times when someone's diagnosed with hypothyroidism, they have low thyroid hormones, but high TSH. All right? And kind of the opposite is true for hyperthyroidism. So if someone has hyperthyroidism, they'll typically have high thyroid hormones, but they'll have low TSH. Okay? All right, this kind of expands on that a bit. Again, a little bit more visual of this physiology. Notice that it all kind of starts up here at the hypothalamus. And the hormone that the hypothalamus produces is known as TRH. Now, TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing. So what that means is it stimulates the release of TSH. Okay, so TRH comes from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary by way of these blood vessels in what's known as a portal system, kind of a detour, stimulates the pituitary to produce TSH. TSH therefore goes to the thyroid, stimulates the thyroid to produce T3 and T4. All right, so this is a very common theme kind of in the endocrine system where you have the hypothalamus controlling the anterior pituitary, which then controls another endocrine gland, in this case the thyroid. And then this figure, notice what it shows. This is called negative feedback. So if there's an overproduction of T3 and T4, those T3 and T4 hormones will act as a negative feedback to bring down the production of TRH and TSH. Okay? And then, like I said, when we get to the thyroid, we'll learn about the function of T3 and T4. But notice the key word here is metabolism. It increases metabolism. All right? Okay, next two hormones are known as gonadotropins. So to be a gonadotropin, you target gonads, all right? And there's two of them we're going to look at. The first one being follicle stimulating hormone, and then the next one is known as luteinizing hormone, all right? Now, some hormones we call tropic, and you're going to come across that word. A tropic hormone is a hormone that stimulates the production of another hormone. Okay? So if we go back to this slide again, TSH is considered a tropic hormone because it is a hormone, but its job is to stimulate another gland to produce hormones. Okay? So that's known as a tropic hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone. We call it a gonadotropin because it's going to stimulate ovaries and testes to produce hormones. All right. In fact, this follicle stimulating hormone only gets produced at puberty because there's a hormone from the hypothalamus, all right, a releasing hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, that when that hormone gets produced, it stimulates the production of the gonadotropins, and thus puberty initiates. Okay? So up until puberty, there's very low levels of this hormone and the next hormone. But once puberty starts, you're going to get more production of these gonadotropins. So follicle stimulating hormone, and the name has to do with what we call ovarian follicles. A follicle is a little container. Right? You've probably heard that word when it comes to like hair follicles. Well, hair follicles contain a hair. Ovarian follicles contain a developing egg, right? So there's going to be a little egg in each of these follicles. But the follicle has to be stimulated in an effort to get it to eventually ovulate, which that's what this shows here. And we'll talk a lot more detail about this when we get to the reproductive system. So don't worry, we're just going to, kind of brush over this function a little bit. So follicle stimulating hormone, when we look at females, ovaries, it stimulates the development of the ovarian follicles. And it stimulates the production of estrogen. So there's that tropic function. In males, different gonad, right? Testes instead of ovaries, it stimulates the production of sperm, and it eventually helps stimulate the production of testosterone as well. All right, we're not going to really get into the hyper and hypo secretion, but obviously if you've got an imbalance of these hormones, you can imagine that there might be problems with fertility and sexual development and things of that nature. Okay, luteinizing hormone, you'll notice, targets are the same, ovaries, testes, produced by the pituitary, anterior pituitary. And when we look at its effect on the ovaries, it stimulates ovulation. So that's the release of the egg from the follicle, so it can then enter what we call the fallopian tubes, or fallopian tube. All right? And then it also helps synthesize or stimulate the production of estrogen and progesterone. And then in males, it's all about that testosterone. So LH, or luteinizing hormone, stimulates testosterone production. And for disorders, again, we're not going to get into detail, but if there's high or low levels of LH, you can imagine there's going to be some reproductive consequences. Okay, next one, prolactin. And this one's also trying to tell you what it does. It promotes lactation. And lactation is milk production. So the main target is mammary glands, and it's going to cause the production of milk. Now, the key here is production, because we're going to learn a different hormone actually stimulates the ejection of the milk from the breast. But prolactin, there's also involvement with estrogen and progesterone, but prolactin stimulates milk production. We're not going to get into the hyper and hypo as much, so we're not going to really go there. But you can imagine if a woman does not produce prolactin, she might not produce milk and therefore be unable to breastfeed. You'll notice, hopefully you've noticed by now, whenever I have something bold in red or bold in purple, I like to use purple, or anything like that, that usually means that's going to be a very important term, or I like to say buzzword. If you remember milk production, you're in pretty good shape there for this hormone. Okay, next one is another tropic hormone. Notice it even has that word in it, tropic. So we know it's going to stimulate the production of another hormone. So this one, adrenocorticotropic, all right, so that word means it must have something to do with the adrenal gland, and it has actually something to do with what's called the cortex of the adrenal gland, which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. So that's its target, the outer layer or adrenal cortex. And then it is a tropic hormone. So what it does is it stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce hormones known as glucocorticoids. And we're going to learn the main one being cortisol. So this one's a kind of like that TSH, where it's produced by the anterior pituitary. It targets another gland, in this case the adrenal gland, and then it causes that adrenal gland to produce a hormone. All right, and there are some disorders, but kind of like the thyroid one, we're going to focus more on disorders of the adrenal gland, but this can act as kind of that compensatory mechanism as well. So for example, we're going to learn that in Addison's disease, there is a low production of cortisol. So it would make sense that if you have low cortisol production, you would have high ACTH production. And then the same is true with, for example, if you have high cortisol, or if you've been given cortisol treatments, these corticosteroid treatments, right, which are derivatives of cortisol. So if you had high cortisol in your body, that would cause this hormone to be low, all right, ACTH. All right. Okay, and again, this is kind of that similar drawing as we saw with thyroid. Notice you have hypothalamus. It produces a releasing hormone. Okay, this is corticotropic releasing hormone, or corticotropin releasing hormone. That stimulates the pituitary to produce ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, and then it too has a negative feedback if it gets too high. Okay, so kind of that same theme that we saw with TSH. All right, this is the last hormone of the anterior pituitary. And then we'll take a break and start a new video. And this one, you're not going to hear a lot about this one. Melanocyte stimulating hormone. When you get into the medical field, you'll probably never hear about it. Super rare to have high or low secretion of this hormone, named after the fact that it does stimulate the melanocytes. So if you have high melanocyte stimulating hormone, you might get darkening of the skin. It's not the reason why people have different amounts of pigmentation in their skin. That's more genetic. But if it's being overproduced, maybe due to a pituitary tumor. So in some cases, if you get a tumor in a gland, that tumor might be a functional tumor, meaning it'll keep producing whatever that gland produces. So if you have a pituitary tumor, there's a chance you could have, hypersecretion of any of those pituitary hormones. It does have some effects in the brain. Most books at our level don't really get into it much, but it does influence brain activity. So for this one, I really wouldn't worry too much about it. Maybe just know that it's a hormone of the anterior pituitary, and it's called melanocyte stimulating hormone because it will stimulate melanin production. So I wouldn't worry about, hyper and hypo, but obviously if you have a lot of it, you'll get hyperpigmentation. If you have, low, you might get, reduced pigmentation. Okay, so that is the end of video 1. I realize that's a lot. All right, that's a lot of information. So what I would recommend doing is let that sink in a little bit. Maybe you've been taking, notes or working on your study guide / guided notes. Let it sink in a little bit. Go get a drink of water. Come back and we'll start talking about the posterior pituitary.